Hello, good afternoon. Hi, Tanisha. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Oh, good. Well, I am, to everybody out there, Assemblymember Kevin McCarty, the Assembly member for the 7th Assembly District here in Sacramento and West Sacramento. This is one of our weekly or every other week Facebook Live town halls on an important topic of the week. We had spent the last few months talking about COVID-19 and what's happening in our communities, but we always want to make sure we're relevant to some of the issues of the day throughout California and throughout our nation. And so today we're going to have a conversation on what's happening in our nation about police accountability, racial justice, racial inequality. We've seen people stepping up all across our nation, people stepping up for the first time, all walks of life, young, old, black, white. So it's really heartwarming, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But and of course, we want to engage people who are participating today, so you can ask us questions or give us comments on some of the things that we're working on at the state capitol, on police reform that I'm working on, or other things we need to focus on related to bringing about racial equality and tackling racial inequality in California. But it was interesting. We try to do these on Fridays. And so last week, we put this to this Friday. We realized, hey, this Friday, today, of course, is Juneteenth. So what an important day to talk about this. And I was reading a lot this morning about how, of course, many people know what Juneteenth is, and we'll talk about it in a second. I know you and I, Tanisha, both do. But a lot of people are learning about it for the first time. So it's interesting that Americans are talking about this more. And so, that's a positive thing. I think one thing that we can learn about this situation is if you want to weed out hate and racism and divisiveness, having more education about culture and community is such a good start. So with that, let's talk about Juneteenth. But before we get there, Tanisha, let's have you again introduce yourself to people watching today.
Hello, my name is Tanisha Humphrey. I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Manager at the Northern California ACLU, and I'm thrilled to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So you and I were talking earlier, Tanisha. Both of our families have roots going back many generations in our country, and so Juneteenth is very personal for me. That many people know, but some who don't know, I am biracial. My mom is from England. My father's African American. So my dad's family was literally from the South in Texas and Louisiana, where Juneteenth is very, very relevant. So I'm actually going to call my dad tonight and ask him any stories that he can share with me about his first memories and celebrating and honoring Juneteenth. So of course we know that it took 2.5 years after the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation that word got to the slaves in Texas and that part of their country that slavery was over, and that it was on this day, roughly in June, that we came to know about Juneteenth. And so it's kind of reflection about freedom, of course, but also brings about so many other memories to where we're at today and our family's history and generations back. So what are you thinking about Juneteenth and your family and the history in America, Tanisha?
That's a great question. I think I personally am really inspired by the foundations of this country, by the promises of the Constitution, concepts like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's a big part of why I was so excited to work for the ACLU. But of course, we know those are just ideals, and that in many, many ways, our country has fallen short of those ideals from its very beginnings. And slavery is just one example of that. And one example of the ways in which, from our country's start, there were several different versions of America and of what it meant to be an American. So for slaves, for example, what did the 4th of July mean? I think Baldwin has a beautiful quote about what to the slave is the 4th of July. Meaningless to say that our country had its independence when there were so many people bound and in chains. So for Black folks, Juneteenth is an incredibly important holiday, is a moment to actually talk about when our ancestors achieved freedoms, and not that distant ancestors. In my family, it's our grandmother's grandmother from slavery, from bondage, and what it means to be the descendant of American slaves in this country, especially in the moment we're in now, as we're seeing some of the impacts of systemic racism being challenged, being fundamentally challenged, and as we're seeing huge requests to undo some of these unjust and racist systems.
Yeah, that's interesting you said that. So I always go back and look at the dates on my ancestry page, and my dad's father, Leon McCarty, he was much older when he had my dad, and my dad's a bit older too. So he was born in 1886. This is my grandpa in Louisiana, and so his father was born in the mid 1860s. So literally when slavery was just coming to an end, or if he was in Louisiana and Texas, so it's quite likely that they hadn't got word. So it's sometimes we think where we're at today and realize that only a few generations back was this ugly part of American history. And so, what do we say to young people today when they think it's so far away, and we realize that, hey, many of those issues are alive and well. And when certainly there's no more slavery and we have freedom, but it's not 100% accurate and equal opportunity through our country, and people are stepping up. So how does that relate to the work we're doing today, especially your work?
I think that, it was Frederick Douglass. Thank you. Frederick Douglass, who said, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." I think that a lot of people, when they start to talk about slavery, when we start to have conversations about what that means in the history of our country, they feel that discomfort, they feel that shame, and then we don't want to talk about it anymore, and we seek to erase our history. I think that's a great injustice. I find a lot of strength and inspiration from thinking about all that my ancestors went through for me to be here today. I think there's a lot of power to be had by reckoning with our past. I think about it this way. There's not a lot that you can do about what your ancestors have done. There's that's just the truth. You can't undo the past, but you can think about the choices that were made and choose to see the ripples of those choices today, and think about how you can change today instead. So we know that the choices that were made in the past were made deliberately to oppress Black people, to oppress non-white people, Indigenous people living in this country. And we have to make different choices to undo that damage in order to make a different future today.
Mm-hmm. There's a conversation that has been happening for years about reparations, and even more so today. And frankly, it's alive and well. At the Capitol, we had a bill that I voted on. I was proud to be a co-author to have California work on this issue. Doesn't mean we're going to start writing checks next year to descendants of slaves. No, but I think the question is a good one, is that are the impacts still alive and well generations later? And I would think unequivocally, yes, we see it. We saw what's happened on the streets of Minneapolis with police issues in communities of color in Black America. We see it with systematic economic oppression. The fact that in some cities, Black population is 10%, but the homeless population is 50%. So we see in our public policy, it's manifesting in all these issues. And so I had a few people who went and asked me, well, I may support reparations, but how would you do it? How would you logistically trace back generations? And then some people say, why should I be held accountable for what happened with my great grandfather? Or why should government be working on this? And when we did reparations for the internment of the Japanese Americans in the World War II, that was less than 50 years ago. And we're talking about impacts of a couple hundred years ago. So what would you say to people that say, why is this relevant today? Why even talk about reparations for such a policy in 2020 when it's so far away?
Well, as we discussed at the very beginning, it's not as far away as we like to think that it is. It's still alive in our systems today. And I think one of the most clear ways that we see that is actually through our criminal justice system, where immediately after slavery, there were explicit choices that were made to criminalize former slaves to try to get them to continue to be indentured and into forced labor and bondage. And we're still seeing that same system that seeks to profit off of the imprisonment and bondage of primarily Black people. So I think that for people who are overwhelmed by conversations about reparations, taking a moment to think about what could that really mean and what could that really look like, in my opinion, it means investing in Black communities meaningfully and intentionally, with the realization that for generations, Black communities have been either robbed or neglected.
Yeah, you know, I think many people have seen it, but there's that incredible movie that came out a few years ago, 13th, about the 13th
Yes.
Amendment and the abolition of slavery and freedom, and what happened to transition into the criminal justice system. So we just found another way to oppress Black individuals and incarcerate people and have them serving as essentially slaves and slave labor while they're imprisoned, and taking away voting rights and poll taxes. And you know, we just voted yesterday on a bill that I had on voting rights for formerly incarcerated. And we know that African Americans are disproportionately impacted by that. And I was proud that was my bill, ACA 6, that's going to get voters. So we'll get to that in a sec. So now, before we get to all these policies, your job with ACLU, you are a grassroots advocacy manager.
That's right.
So I know there's a lot of grassroots advocacy going on in our country in general, especially the last couple of years under this administration at the federal level. But you know, we see it like we've never seen it before the last few weeks after George Floyd. And so, tell me, what do you see as far as the interest in people wanting to step up and engage on these issues? And
I think whenever there is a moment where police brutality, police violence comes to the center of our national conversation, it's very hard on me personally. I have to go through a period of mourning. I have to go through a period of recognition of what this means for a community that I love and value and find great joy in being a part of. But I also I know that as a nation, we've been paying attention to and having much more concrete conversations about this for years now. So I'm actually feeling at this moment very hopeful about the number of people who are willing to engage in a conversation about how can we change police departments in a meaningful way. And so I know that this conversation about defunding the police is one that makes people nervous and uncomfortable. And what I'd really say to that is to deeply question that feeling of discomfort, to allow yourself to sit in that discomfort and to listen to members of your community, to members of the Black community, for folks who've been organizing and working on this for years. Listen to their needs and how they propose to meet those needs, to understand that before reacting to that discomfort. So that it's so easy to be like, this is hard, we shouldn't do it, or this is hard, so it's not the way forward. But really question that.
so I want to get to the whole defund the police and what that really means. And of course, there's a lot of scare tactics that people are using on the opposite side in this issue. But before we get there, why do you think it's different this time as far as the advocacy, the engagement, the protests on the streets? I mean, we've had these incidents after Ferguson and Shamir Rice and Eric Garner, and here in Sacramento, Stephon Clark. Why is it different this time?
I think two things are happening. One, for people like me, I feel like it has to be different this time. I personally cannot go through this again. Like, you reach a point where you've had the same situations repeating again and again in your community and having a personal impact, and you feel like you have to make it stop. And I think that there are many people who are feeling the same way. This has to stop. And I'm seeing a willingness from people to actually stand up and defend that notion, to actually get involved. I have so much admiration for people who are willing to protest right now, knowing the great personal risks that they're taking. And I'm seeing people who are actually taking a moment to be thoughtful. I think too often we rush in, we try to be a savior, and we think that we know all the answers. I know Black organizers who have been working on this for years and years, and who have been frustrated when they don't get the credit they deserve, or when the solutions that are put forward are not the ones that they actually need. So in this moment, I'm hearing from Black organizers first, and I'm hearing people who are willing to echo and continue to lift up the voices of Black organizers, and that's a really critical difference.
Yeah, I totally concur. And just one more simplistic thing I think makes a difference in these police reform issues is that people can see it now with their own two eyes. You're probably too young, but I remember when I was, your generation, a little bit younger, and I saw the footage of Rodney King in Los Angeles, and that was rare. And I say this, I've been saying this quite often. It was rare to see that. And an individual pulled over, he saw someone getting arrested, he saw a little scuffle. He took out a camera from the back of his car, which was rare to have that. And he filmed this, and Black America had always said, "Hey, this is not a one-off. This happens far too often." But it was rare that we saw it, and we saw it then. And now we see it all the time. We see with people's cell phone cameras, the dash cam from cars, the body cam for officers, street cams. So people can see it. But the footage that we saw in Minneapolis of 8 minutes of essentially a murder before our own eyes. It was literally like a public lynching, literally. Comparison going back, if you think about, the Juneteenth and later in Jim Crow, and what we had to face in our country with this horrific past. People, I think, said, no, this can't continue. And so I'm heartened by that when I saw the rally here in Sacramento, I saw so many young people, and it was so diverse that it's not just an issue for a community, it's an issue for what's right and wrong. So with that, we have a lot of intensity as far as what we can do to reform policing and criminal justice. And certainly we can talk about too, the criminal justice and the school to prison pipeline, the fact that in California in the last 30 years, we built over 25 prisons, we've built 2 colleges. And so, but the policing, let's talk about that for a bit. So there's a bunch of bills that we're working on, that I'm authoring some, we've tried, and they're getting a lot of traction now. But there's this other issue that people are asking, hey, should we defund the police? It's become a clever hashtag and a slogan. So what does that mean? What does defund the police mean to you?
Yes, I want to emphasize again that if that phrase defund the police makes you uncomfortable, to spend a moment to really listen and do the research of figuring out what communities are asking for and specific to your community. So here in Sacramento, there are a number of great groups leading the way on this issue. I'm going to list just a few of them, but there's so many more. Jobs to Justice, Youth Forward, Decarcerate Sacramento, the Anti-Police Terror Project of Sacramento, Black Women Organized for Political Action, Sacramento Act. These are just a few organizations currently working on these issues where you can get involved and learn more about it. But really, it's about defunding, reconciling, and reinvesting. And so here in Sacramento, there's a significant ask to reduce the police budget and then to invest instead in early childhood education, trauma-informed care, reentry programs, and affordable housing. And a real moment of recognizing that police do not guarantee safety. And I think that's a narrative that deserves changing. Police do not lead to safety. Safety will not be gained through the surveillance and criminalization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and when people are saying defund the police, I know the answer. Does that mean we will eliminate the police department, or look at the budgets and how you can potentially reallocate resources in a smarter way? It
means reallocating resources in a smarter way. It does mean limiting let me say this very carefully. It does mean limiting the impact of policing. It does mean removing police officers policing from areas where it doesn't help, doesn't belong. We had a few questions that came in before the town hall that said things like police right now are asked to do too many things. They're involved in too many different ways. And I think that's exactly correct. For example, we don't need police officers in our schools. That's not a place for them. It's not effective, and it doesn't lead to the safety of our students. It in fact does the opposite. So saying things like defund the police also means reducing police involvement and relying instead on solutions that we know actually work: community-based organizations, social workers, housing. More policing doesn't reduce crime, but what we found is that housing, affordable, accessible housing, is actually what makes communities safer. Let's invest in that instead.
Yeah, I concur. I think that there's some segment of the population that would want to eliminate and have no police department. I think that's small. I think people who even support law enforcement think, you know what, maybe we don't use our police dollars in the most efficient manner. Should we have, police go out and respond to calls where there's a mental health issue or a neighborhood squabble or something with kids, and maybe we should have a social worker and a mental health professional go out to those. And so I think that's, when you say defund the police, it's not necessarily getting rid of the department. It's looking at the responsibilities, and certainly if there's major violent crime, that's where we all want public safety to keep us safe. But that's not always the case. When someone is falling asleep at a drive-through at a fast food restaurant and maybe had a drink or too much, and we saw that tragically before our own two eyes in Atlanta last week, and so. Sometimes law enforcement is right on, does it well, and sometimes it's not, as we know, has terrible, awful consequences. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right. When you think about public schools, there's a debate here in our Sacramento City School District. The slogan is counselors, not cops. Mm-hmm. And some of the schools have the counselor ratio is one counselor per 1,000 students, and the national goal is 250 to 1. Mm-hmm. So one counselor for every 250 students. And so the notion is, maybe we could bring some more social workers and mental health professionals and nurses and counselors into schools with the money that we're spending on police and make those schools safer. And so it's not that you don't believe in public safety, but kind of reallocating some of those resources. So what do you see happening with this movement? Are there changes across California? I know what Sacramento's talking about, but do you see that cities are looking to reimagine their police departments with this movement?
I think so, but I also know it's going to take a concentrated effort. So yes, I am an organizer and an activist. I believe in the power of people, in the power of our collective voices coming together. I think we're going to have to continue putting pressure on city councils. I think the only way that change will happen is if we keep working and pressuring to make it happen. I mean, it's been years of work to get this far, and I'm grateful we are this far, but we gotta keep going.
Yeah, so I see here someone says counselors, not cops. We had a comment earlier from Chris saying we expect too much of our police to fill too many roles. And sometimes we do feel for police. They're out there, they're not trained to be the social worker and the addiction counselor and mental health. And he's saying, how can we consider filling these roles with other positions and saying the right person for the right response to better meet the community's needs? I think that 80% of the population would agree on that, no matter how you feel about law enforcement. Glenda asks how we can continue to put pressure on city councils to reallocate resources for services that are better performed by others. So you focused on advocacy. We have people here that want to be advocates. They're here today. So how could they best use their voice on these issues?
I encourage you to seek out these organizations in Sacramento that are leading this effort, organizations like the Movement for Black Lives and the Anti-Police Terror Project here in Sacramento. local organizations who have been leading the movement for racial justice for a long time and follow their lead. So we have a limited amount of time to do this, right? Budgets are decided in June and July, which is literally right now. And I can promise you that these organizations are holding press conferences and town halls and call-in days, and they need support, but they need support from people who are willing to listen and follow. And so that's what I encourage everyone to do. And that's what we at the ACLU are doing at this moment.
Okay, we had a comment here from Muriel, and also somebody typed in earlier, Joanne, talking about training for peace officers and de-escalation and specific cultural training. I was one of the authors of the bill last year, the AB 392, the California Act of Civil Rights, which changed some of the police practices on the use of force and deadly force, and having departments focus more on de-escalation. Is that working? Do you think that police departments need to do more in this space?
I think this is a hard one for people. So AB 392, the California Act to Save Lives, is a great example of the amount of work it took to pass that law, the amount of advocates and people who came together, and the amount of legislators who were willing to do the right thing. And yet, and still, the law went into effect in January, and what we're seeing across California and here in Sacramento is that police and sheriff departments are not willing to update their use of force policies. They're willing to be in flagrant violation of the law. Here in California, we have some really good laws around policing, and we have some really good laws around policing proposed. But I think that one thing that's been so frustrating is that Minneapolis was actually a case study in having a ton of training, being grounded in community-based policing. A lot of resources went into reforming the police department of Minneapolis, and yet this still happened. We've had decades of training, of funding police departments to try to get them to be better, and yet we found that they are not better. And so I think that the call that's going out right now is no more funding for training, no more implicit bias trainings, no more de-escalation training, no more funding for de-escalation tactics like rubber bullets and tear gas, no more. I honestly think that organizers are fed up with trying to make police departments better. And we've reached a point of just saying, like, we're not going to continue to invest in something that's not working. We know what does work, community-based solutions. We know that, and that's what we want to be investing in instead. So if a training is going to cost money, no, we don't want to do it.
Okay, hey, just a quick answer. I see Ed Fletcher asked earlier about reparations, and yeah, before you jumped on, yes, I do support California working on this. We passed a bill few weeks ago on this. I think we even got a Republican or two to vote for it. And I'm a co-author of that. And it's not going to have reparations start right away, but it creates a commission to study it, to think about what it means, what California could and should and can do. So stay tuned. So we're going to flip the switch here, and you're going to be the interviewer and ask me questions.
Okay.
No music and no flip the switch dancing like that. I'm not that cool, but
I'm really excited about this. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to ask you some questions.
Okay.
And so I know you've done a ton of work on this issue already, and that you're currently in the middle of proposing some great laws. So as a member of the California Legislative Black Caucus, what legislation do you think is most critical in reimagining police departments?
I don't think there is one thing. I think we've gotten to the point that there are several big pieces that we need to address. And so I'll give you a handful of the ones that I'm either authoring or working on that have been endorsed by the Legislative Black Caucus. One of my big priorities for the last 5 years, I've tried, this is my third time, is dealing with the aftermath and the investigations after incidents of deadly force at the hands of police. It's not always a shooting, as we saw in Minneapolis with the knee to the neck of Mr. Floyd. But many times, as we know, we have the police policing themselves, and that's just not fair. Nobody trusts the outcome. We have local DAs doing the investigations, and so many of our communities are so tight and cozy with local law enforcement, it creates a conflict of interest. Maybe it's not a legal or inherent, but clearly it's a perceived conflict. So there are 7 states that have changed who does the investigations after incidents of deadly force, and I'm reintroducing my bill this year. And it'll have the Attorney General be the lead in the investigation. So I think that'll bring about more accountability when officers do cross the line with the new standards in 392. We know that what's reasonable and what's not reasonable for a use of force, especially deadly force. The other part of the bill I'm working on is how do you prevent this in the first place? So we're going to have the Attorney General help with police departments and do auditing of their practices and talk about, like Sacramento after Stephon Clark, they changed their policy for this called the fleeing felon rule, or fleeing suspect, literally. And so we saw this in Atlanta. When an individual's fleeing, do you obviously not shoot a person in the back when they're running away? And so Sacramento didn't have a good policy on this. And so after the Attorney General came and made some recos to the city, they changed the rules. So that's one of my big bills. Another big issue in California is we have officers who unfortunately cross the line with excessive force, and frankly, it costs us too. There's huge settlements and taxpayers paying out lawsuits for wrongful death, use of force, so it impacts money that we have to fix up our parks and communities. So but also a lot of these officers either get fired or they quit right before they get fired. So another bill we're working on is on decertifying peace officers who have a track record of excessive force. If you're a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, even a person who does a nail salon, you have to get a license. And if you mess up, you lose your license. And we don't do that with peace officer status. So that's a bill we're working on. There's another bill that I'm authoring on oversight of sheriff departments right here in Sacramento, Exhibit A. We had our sheriff that didn't like oversight and says, hey, oversight is my election every 4 years. That's my oversight. And we think that's not right, that county supervisors should be able to have oversight bodies or the electorate. So we have a bill that would clarify that these boards can't be ignored by the local sheriff and give them subpoena power. Not to run sheriff departments, but to gather information and make recommendations to the county. We have another bill that Assemblymember Holden's authoring on duty to intervene. As we saw in Minneapolis, one of the police officers just stood and watched as a police officer murdered Mr. Floyd, and so it would have some consequences for officers that don't step up. And I think that would change behavior dramatically. Those are a few. We have a bill too on the chokehold, banning the chokehold, and whether it's the carotid hold or any other policy which has kind of the chokehold, the sleeper hold they used to call it in LA. So that's a snapshot, maybe 5 of the big bills on police issues. We have other bills on. And it's not just, as we talked about earlier in this era, it's not just policing. It's if you look about racial justice, it's economics, it's education. So we're looking at those criminal justice reforms. We're looking at those issues as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, there are a lot of bills right now that will hopefully make a really big impact. So as you think about racial justice and its overlap with economic justice, what are steps that we can take to dismantle systemic racism?
Yeah, there's 2 things that we're working on related to economic justice and economic oppression for Black California that are in our legislative package. One is the reparations measure that we talked about, which we're going to take a look at, and again, form a commission, study it, come up with recommendations how we can make direct and indirect impacts to Black Californians and descendants of slaves, essentially. We also are going to put on the ballot. This is where you can come in engaged, Tanisha, and people watching today. It's not just about me, the politician with a fancy title. It's you and the community in voting. So this November, we're going to put on the ballot a measure related to affirmative action. 25 years ago, the people of California voted on Prop 209 to get rid of affirmative action. That was in a very different time, very divisive time in our state. The governor was going to run for president. He was looking to find ways to divide Californians. Kind of sounds familiar. We see that some from our other political leaders today too. And so that narrowly passed in 1996. The electorate is very different now. So we're going to go back to the voters to take a look at affirmative action. And just so we know, affirmative action is not quotas. It's not, hey, you're Black or Latino, you get an automatic seat in the University of California. It allows government to consider race in these decisions, not bring an actual quota. So I think that will make a big difference as far as economics, these two things that we're working on.
Excellent. Can I ask, what inspires you as you think about racial justice in this country? What's something that you go back to over and over again when in moments where it gets frustrating or it gets hard? What keeps you going?
I think two things. One, I think back to my family and what they went through. I think of my grandfather. His name was Leon McCarty. He was born in the South, in the Jim Crow South during Reconstruction in 1886. And in 1905, he fled. He left Louisiana to go west. He wanted to come to California. He went to Arizona first. And, I think about, people like that who just wanted to have a chance and an opportunity and couldn't stay where they were living in places where there was, extreme oppression and literally lynchings. So I think about that. I think about the journey that so many people of color, not only African Americans, but Asians, Latinos in our country have tried to make the most of it, and we have systems that hold people back, essentially. So that is always a big draw to be able to make a difference. And then I see it today. I'm very fortunate. I'm very blessed. But so many people in our community are getting left behind, and they were born into poverty and intergenerational poverty, and how it transcends with race as well. And it reminds me that there are things that we can do, like you said earlier, investing in education, early education. That's literally why I ran for office. That was my slogan, that we should invest in little kids and not prisons. I think if we had way more slots for preschoolers, we'd have fewer slots needed in our state prison system. And so that inspires me to make a difference. And then just hearing the stories and the pains of people and what they go through just reminds me that our work's not done, and that government isn't the solution for everything, but it has a chance to help people and bring about fairness and true equal opportunity for people in California.
I saw a number of questions in the chat about the reparations process that you're working on, including how long it might take. And I'm wondering if you can also talk about your vision for reparations in California. I heard you mention a little bit, but would love for you to talk more.
Yeah, so I think this is a question of values. Do we think that we should have such a thing, and then what it would look like? So I believe that we should have this conversation, and we should have some type of action as far as reparations for Black Californians. And you can say affirmative action is part of that, but it's potentially much more to that as well. But we don't know the answers to that. And so I think the question is is Juneteenth and the end of slavery and the 14th Amendment and our Constitution enough that, hey, we're all free, we have equal opportunity, everybody can make the most of it? Or do we have systemic racial oppression and biases? And I look at our education system, our criminal justice system, who's homeless. If you look at Black California, they're on the last, they're worst or first. First is the worst, first in homelessness and incarceration and equal pay and so forth. And so there's so much more we need to do. I think it's obvious. I don't know what it would look like. So as opposed to coming out with the answer, like this is our reparations plan. Everybody will get X check, X amount of resources, land, and so forth. I don't know yet. So this would create like a year-long process to form a commission and study it and come back to the legislature that we'd have to vote to talk about what it would be. So I think too, it starts the conversation. This is a hard conversation. Many people say, why on earth would we be doing that? And so I think it's a difficult thing that we're talking about in our country right now. I think this is part of the equation. So stay tuned. There's no clear answer of what it'll look like, but it looks like this bill will get to the governor. The governor said he would sign it. So that would start a process for California to engage on this. And it's not just California. Of course, some people say, why California? California wasn't a slave state in the South. But, we were built on the impacts of that. And this is a federal issue as well. So there's a federal measure to look at reparations as well.
At the ACLU, we actually have a project, the Gold Chains Project, which explores the impacts of slavery here in California, slaves that were brought here, slaves that lived their lives here. And so we can see that even though California wasn't a slave state, California did have slavery and was very much impacted and shaped by slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that we've been talking about that I want to name directly is the multiple ways that racism and other systems of oppression can impact someone. So whether it's in schooling or whether it's through criminal justice, we've been talking about how different prejudice and discrimination that people can face in their everyday lives. So can you talk a little bit about how different systems of oppression intersect? It's a complicated question. It's a big question. Let me know.
Yeah. Say it again. I was skimming over here on the right at some questions, but go say one more time.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about how multiple systems of oppression intersect. So we've talked about our school system, we've talked about criminal justice, but we know that one person has to navigate multiple systems. What do those intersections look like?
Well, I think about, education and how if you're born in a certain community, your life expectancy, your educational expectancy, your opportunities are based upon where you were born. And I'll tell you a very sad fact here in Sacramento. For those here in Sacramento, if you know the Land Park neighborhood, there's a Target over there by near Broadway. Literally, there's one street, I think it's McClatchy, and right off of Broadway. You could live in one house, which is near the public housing, and you can go to an elementary school that has some of the worst test scores in our school districts. And you could live across the street. Literally, you can throw a golf ball from one house to the next. And you live in that other house. You go to a school called Crocker Riverside, which has the best student achievement in our city. So literally, you could live 50 feet away from somebody and your life can dramatically change. And so there are so many intersects on our policy. And what does that mean? It means that if you are behind with your peers, you're more likely to end up, in the juvenile justice system, potentially without a high school diploma. And, high school diploma, impacts your job earnings in your life. You have $1 million and less earnings. And even for us, for taxpayers, a high school dropout has the average cost to taxpayers of $250,000 in increased public services, potential justice costs, and so forth. So it has a huge intersect on people's opportunity and being able to break intergenerational poverty, but also on us as well as a society.
Absolutely. I think about that a lot. The idea of the American dream being that you can work hard and that hard work will equal success, right? I think that a lot of people believe that almost without question, but we see lots of reasons why this isn't true. We see that some folks have better choices from the very beginning. And studies have shown that actually the biggest indicator of how successful someone will be has little to do with how hard that person works. It's actually their zip code, which seems arbitrary at best, but seems more purposeful when we consider things like redlining and a history of denying loans to people of color and purposeful segregation so that communities of color all had to live together, and then removing resources and opportunity from those communities. I saw one question, it passed by really quickly, if we could also address environmental justice and how that impacts race, the intersection between the environment and racism, I think is a really interesting one. Do you want to try to talk about that at all?
Yeah, if you think about where areas where people have, asthma issues and bad air quality, let's face it, they're going to put the industrial type plants and factories where they recycle batteries and have, lead issues and so forth. They're going to put them in the brown and black neighborhoods. They've been doing that for generations, as opposed to the posh neighborhoods where the affluent are. I remember when I was a city council member, they wanted to put an underground natural gas storage facility in this neighborhood called Glen Elder, which is a brown and black area in southeast Sacramento. Some people here maybe remember this about 5-6 years ago, and there's no way that would ever fly in East Sac or Land Park or the Pocket. And it literally almost passed with a vote. And it took a big push to talking about environmental justice to really fight that back. And so that's an issue that I know we're working on with our environmental laws, and really building a coalition to make sure we understand that it's not just the coast, and it really impacts some of the urban areas throughout California as well. Yeah, so let's get back to some of these questions. So, God, there are so many good questions. Let's see. Okay, somebody asks about the budget. What should we do in the budget as far as education funding? Yes, we're not going to cut money for our schools this year. That's the good news I can announce. Our budget deal with the governor, we are not going to cut money for our schools. That's the worst thing we could be doing right now. There's another question I want to ask. If you have any, you can ask those too. Someone talked about these lynchings in Southern California that have been so far labeled suicides. I believe the Attorney General is doing investigations on that. I fully support that. Somebody asked about settlements for excessive force. I have another bill on that I'm doing, AB 1314, which would simply say that the city of Sacramento, County of Sacramento would have to report how much they pay out every year in settlements and lawsuits and settlements for excessive force. I know the city of Sacramento and the county combined has spent over $25 million in the past year on excessive force settlements, and those are monies that could go to our parks, our communities, and so forth. Do you see any questions you want to tackle on the right here?
Oh, there are a lot of questions. I'm so grateful that people have been so engaged.
Okay, here's a question that Javier asks. I doubt it's Javier Becerra, but it's Javier. He says, why are police unions allowed to protect officers who have multiple complaints and misconduct incidents from being terminated from their employment? Well, two things. Just came out today that the police chiefs of California, 8 police chiefs, including our police chief here in Sacramento, are proposing a new law to give them more power to terminate police officers who have abused their power. And so I think we're seeing more and more that police officers realize that these so-called bad apples, it's not just an apple, there's way too many of them, but it makes it bad for them too. It makes their life more difficult, and it puts their life at risk. Because literally in the last few weeks here, we've seen some of these protests, and there have been acts of violence against police officers, and that is totally unacceptable, where officers have been fired upon and shot. I think there's one fatality across our nation. And I think there's a lot of angst and anger coming about by officers who do cross the line. And so there is a consequence to what's happening. So I think you're going to see more police stepping up, but we can't assume they're going to do it on their own. That's why we need to help push this. I'll note that, for example, on my bill on independent investigations for deadly force, 5 years ago, the police unions and the police chiefs thought this was a terrible idea. Essentially, they said some horrible things about me and what a horrible idea this was. I'll leave it at that. And I was heartened this week that many of those same groups are now endorsing this idea. So I think that even the police organizations know that it's time for change.
Hopefully. I saw this question that was like, institutionalized racism is such a big problem. How and where can we start? And I give credit to people who are even asking that question, because that means you've already started. And I think that there are a couple of places that feel really, really urgent right now. I think this conversation about police violence is one that's particularly important and particularly urgent for people. And I know you've been having conversations about COVID-19. Addressing disparities in healthcare is a really urgent place to start right now, because Black and brown folks and Indigenous folks here in California are dying at a disproportionate rate. And we've seen that inequality in our healthcare system for a long time. And if we can start to turn that around so that we can have more equity in healthcare, that'll lead to a huge increase in the quality of life for people of color here in California.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question here on POBAR. A lot of people don't know what that means, but that's the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. And California is one of the strongest laws in the nation protecting officers, giving them, of course, like anybody else, due process, but some would argue too much protection to investigate excessive force, use of deadly force sometimes. So do you have any thoughts on the Peace Officer Bill of Rights and what California should do on that?
We are actively looking into solutions for some of the issues raised in the Police Officer Bill. We have seen states across the country who have been able to undo some of the things in the Police Officer Bill of Rights, and we're wondering if we could introduce some of these legislations in California. We actually have an amazing member of our Sacramento ACLU chapter who's been doing tons of research on this for years, and so we're very excited to be working with them to see what might be possible in California. The truth is that officers have a lot of protection, partially from the Police Officer Bill of Rights, partially from the unions. And I think that's another reason why the call has really been to defund officers, because time and time again, efforts to hold officers accountable or change behavior have been thwarted. So the thought is very much, let's stop investing in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting that what you say is that, like anything else, there are laws that California reviews, and how's it working? Are there things that need to be tightened up? Even if it is a very ingrained part of California law and law enforcement, like anything else, we review our policies and laws on a regular basis to make sure they work. We did this a couple years ago with records. There was a measure by Senator Nancy Skinner, 1421, which I supported, which makes some of these records for disciplined officers public. So the public can know, and we can protect communities when they want to get on their job for somewhere else. And so it impacts all of us. And talking about those settlements that taxpayers have to pay out, if we can prevent some rogue officers from shopping around from one department to another, we can protect lives, and also we can save our taxpayers money in the long run. So there have been a few measures where we chipped away is the wrong word, but really taken a look at POBAR and brought about some smart reforms. And so I concur there'll be people looking at that as well. I would say that it's not just California, the state of New York. Governor Cuomo just signed a measure a couple days ago, which brings sunshine to police records of use of force in the state of New York. So not just California. Someone's asking here about a national database on police violence. Yes, but President Trump is proposing that. So I'm sure there's a simple Excel list for people who get fired for real true excessive force, or people who have a pattern or practice of doing stuff just below. And so I think we need to make sure we have a robust database to make sure that officers don't shop from one department to the next. And that's what we're looking at with the decertification law. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, someone here asked about what about instituting mandatory reporting laws similar to teachers. That's Nicolasa. And yeah, that's a good idea. That's going to be in one of the laws that one of my Black Caucus colleagues is authoring. Some of them are Holden on the duty to intervene, but also the duty to report. So sometimes you may not be able to intervene in time to stop it, but when you go back and fill out your police report, you should make sure that your department knows about use of force, so make sure that can be properly investigated. Someone that once again wants to know what concrete steps will we take to defund the police. That's more at a local level. Honestly, I'm at the state level, but I think it's not just defunding it per se. It's looking at the budgets and looking at how we can allocate resources to bring about public safety, like we talked about earlier. Public safety means more than police cars and badges and guns and handcuffs. There are a lot of ways to make our community safer. Like in schools, you could have an officer in a squad car sitting up front, or you could hire with the same amount of money a counselor and a social worker. So what's going to do the most? What's going to bring the most benefit for that school? And so there are different ways how you can look at budgets. But I would encourage you to do that at the local level. I know that the city of Sacramento is having a very robust and sometimes heated conversation right now.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tanisha.
I know that we are supporting efforts that look to reinvest in community-based solutions. We're looking at the state level at bills that prioritize community-based organizations, at bills that address reparations and that address some of the loopholes that officers are able to slip through in terms of accountability. So I'm actually very grateful for some of the bills that you're working on, Assemblymember, and some of the statewide bills that I think could potentially make a big difference. And I think that local advocacy around defunding the police to city councils is extremely important and necessary right now.
Yeah. So obviously, some people are way more engaged than others. And sometimes the people that you work with as the ACLU advocacy manager are people that are like in the trenches. They're showing up at school board meetings and city council meetings. And it's easier now. Last night we had a school board meeting that went till I think 2 in.the morning with public testimony on funding school police officers, but people can now do it from their home or the phone.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole COVID-19 has brought about, I think, more democracy to some extent. But what would you recommend for people that just aren't super engaged? They've never done it before. Maybe they're showing up for the first time and saying, you know what, let's say I'm Caucasian, I'm white. I've had the privilege of living a blessed life, and they're living in some neighborhood in Sacramento or across the state, and they're like, I want to do something. And they're seeing that it's not enough just to not be not racist. Silence is violence, and they're thinking about those things in their own minds. And what would you say to someone like that? What they could do? How do you start? How did they start talking about this or stepping up and doing something?
I definitely think listening first. I know I emphasized that earlier, that feeling of discomfort that folks can face while still also wanting to get involved. So following the leadership of Black organizers, of Black-led organizations, of the organizations who are doing this work right now is the right thing to do. And so that does mean, like, if you're thinking like, oh, I'm ready, I want to get going, let me do something, taking a moment to say, let that something be doing research into what are the organizations in my community that are doing this work and what are the calls to action that they are asking for. These incredible organizations have made it as easy as possible for people to get involved. They'll send you toolkits. They'll send you already the contact information for your boards of supervisors and for your city council boards and ways that you can get involved. We need your voice. So please do get involved. Look into the Anti-Police Terror Project, look into the Movement for Black Lives, other organizations here in Sacramento that are doing amazing work.
Okay. There was a question I just want to get to. Stephanie asked, what about ethnic studies? And that's another big bill on the Black Caucus to-do list for 2020. There are two measures. One, which would make ethnic studies a requirement for CSU grads. And that passed yesterday with bipartisan support. So that's fabulous. And what does that mean? I think if you want to stomp out racism and hate, you know, education is a good place to start. So I can't help to think that having more people educated on the diversity of California, that certainly would be a huge positive step as far as understanding and compassion and racial healing. It's not just at higher education. We have another bill that would have it at the high school level too. And that bill is going through the process in the legislature. Some people said, what about UC? Why not CSU? UC, as some may know, in the state constitution, they're autonomous, so the legislature can't tell them what to do. But they are working on that at the UC level as well. So we have now got to 1 hour, and we have so many questions and issues we didn't address. But I will say, somebody asked too about this video and where it would be. This will be up on my Facebook page, so you can go find it there. And we can't get to all of these questions, but I think we got to the majority of them, or talked about the themes in most of them. So what parting comments do you have you want to share with me and my district or people of California about where we're at today in 2020 on Juneteenth and police reform and racial equality?
I want to emphasize again the call to get involved with community organizations who are doing this work, to follow your lead. We need your voices, and they could really use your help. So I'm going to list just a few organizations, and it's definitely not all of them. So I really encourage folks to learn about organizations that are working in your community, in your area. So a few Sacramento-based organizations that are doing great work include Jobs to Justice, Youth Forward, Decarcerate Sacramento, the Anti-Police Terror Project of Sacramento, Black Women Organized for Political Action, Sacramento Act. So that's just a few. There are so many more organizations that are doing this incredible work. And if you are feeling concerned at this moment, if you are feeling like, I want to get involved, I want to do something, there's so much work to be done and we could really use you.
Yes. Excellent. And I just want to close out by saying that, look, California has done a lot on these issues, especially on police reform, but we haven't done enough. And I've always had this slogan in my life that, you know, if you're always talking about what you did yesterday, you haven't done much today. And so the people of California and Sacramento are showing up in mass and saying, hey, it's time to do more. No more tinkering around the edges. We want systematic change, systematic reform. So I'm certainly heartened by that. And I'm pushing measures at the Capitol that I've tried before, but I need your help. I need the help of the people of this region to call their legislators. Some of these votes are really hard. Some of the things we're trying to do on the criminal justice front are very difficult. And, it's not easy. I will say that I think people have come around. I had a big bill on parole reform, but I couldn't get the required 41 votes 2 years ago, I got to 39. And I had the same bill up 3 days ago, and I got 65 votes, including about 7 Republicans. So I think this era, we're seeing it change. But the point I'm trying to make is that I'm your assembly member. Certainly, I have the logo here and the fancy title, but I work for you. This is a representative democracy, and I represent people in my district, and I need you to help me. I need you to help call. If you're not in my district, call your local representative who's next to me. I share this area with our state senator as well, with a couple of them. So help me push this agenda forward, because we're all in this. We're all in this together. So with that, thank you for participating with me today, and have a good rest of your Friday, and happy Juneteenth to
Thank you so much.
and everybody watching.
Happy Juneteenth.
Yes, thank you. Happy Juneteenth. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.